Um, Another thing that religion can offer spirituality is a common language. And I want to talk about that a bit. Young people today who say they're spiritual but not religious hardly have a language to talk about their experiences. They'll hug a tree and then they get called tree-hugging eco-types or whatever, you know. But they'll hug a tree in order to feel the energy of the tree. And they'll often say to me that they're astonished that they can feel an energy in the tree and that they think they're the first, they almost think they're the first person to feel this. This is the amnesia quality that exists in spirituality today. They don't realise that feeling they have for nature, and I think it's a very good thing that a lot of our youth have this spiritual connection with nature. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Because I think that that's so important for the future of the planet, for the future of ecology, for environmental sensitivity. As Thomas Berry, the famous eco-theologian from New York, said, "If nothing is sacred, nothing matters." And I think that's part of the reason why we have this environmental disaster on our hands at the moment. You know, an environmental crisis is the wrong term. It's a human crisis. We have created the environmental crisis, I think, by not caring enough for the land. So it's not really an environmental crisis, it's a human consciousness crisis. If we cared enough, we wouldn't treat or mistreat the land the way we do. So the idea of the land being sacred, which of course it is for Aboriginal people, is hugely important with regard to not only our understanding of the presence of God in creation, but also for our physical, biological and social health as individual human beings. And I think that a lot of young people today, to their credit, have a very spontaneous feeling about the environment. Both my daughters, for instance, are in this situation. And then, although they had a religious upbringing, they'd probably say they're spiritual but not religious today, perhaps with a smile because they know what their dad's work is involved in. But that I feel that Aboriginal people are very important in showing us how to actually feel for the land. And we can be encouraged by their example. On the Irish side of my family, my mother's family come from Donegal, which, as they say in Ireland, is the northernmost part of Southern Ireland, in typical Irish humour, the northernmost part of Southern Ireland. Celtic spirituality is very much a spirituality of place, of rivers, of creeks, of brooks, of mountains. And Celtic spirituality is a very real way, I think, in which those of us who aren't Aboriginal can draw on Celtic spirituality as a form of resource for how to be spiritual in Australia. Although we might find the Aboriginal religion too far removed from us in time and in space, when D.H. Lawrence came to Sydney, actually it was Wollongong, he said he wanted to connect with the genius, as he called it, the spirit of Australia, but he said it's too far back. He said it's 50, 60, 70,000 years back. He said, and this is interesting in view of this current conference, he said, it's too big of a gap and I would fall in that gap. That's what he actually said. I would fall in that gap. I can't make the connection. And then he was here in New South Wales for a while writing his famous novel Kangaroo, and he wrote someone back in Perth saying he's going to leave Australia because he can't make a connection. He was an Englishman from Nottingham, and he went off and set up the rest of his short life actually in Taos, Pueblo in New Mexico, which is now of course a part of the United States. And I read all that with great sensitivity and respect for Lawrence, but also a bit of anger. We don't have that choice. Those of us who are Australians have to cross that gap. I mean, he had a choice. He was an Englishman and he was on searching for a spiritual home. He wanted to find it in Australia and couldn't find it here, so he moved on. And I respect that, and a lot of Australian nationalists sort of say, oh, he's a whinging pom. you know, and couldn't connect to Australia. But I understand what he means. And had I not had my upbringing in Central Australia, say for instance where I now live, which is in the Yarra Valley in Melbourne, if I'd grown up in the Yarra Valley, I don't think, frankly, that I would have been able to make that connection with Aboriginal culture either. Partly because in Melbourne, as of course in Sydney, we've all got this legacy, in Tasmania and so on, a lot of the Aboriginal people were massacred by the early white settlers. And if they weren't massacred, a lot of them died through introduced diseases, even the common cold. I'm not just talking about tuberculosis, but ordinary viruses had never been in this country before. They wiped out literally tens of thousands of Aboriginal people who hadn't built up immunity in their bodies to combat introduced diseases from Europe. So living in Melbourne, I feel like I'm falling in a gap to some extent, because coming from Alice Springs, where the Aboriginal connection was so important for me, I can't find it in Melbourne. And so I'm constantly going back to Alice Springs, either by car or train or plane. And every time I get there, I kind of feel at home. I know it's a bit sort of perhaps sentimental, but that's where I actually feel that my belonging still resides.